Hello everyone, hi. So I have found that when people talk about German literature, they often talk about Goethe, Kafka, maybe Thomas Mann, and then it kind of stops. Beyond that, German literature is often treated as untranslatable and therefore inaccessible to readers outside of the German language community. But German literature is so much more than Goethe and Kafka. It is rooted in a rich oral tradition, and it deals throughout the centuries with religious struggle, self-discovery, political crisis, and fragmentation. German literature is really one long story, one long beautiful story about what it means to be human. And that is why one of my aims here on this channel is to make German literature more accessible to readers outside of the German language, and to give it the kind of attention that, say, English literature is getting on the internet. So anyways, for that, I've spent the past 2 months going through 10 or so books of German and world literature. I have some of them here with me. Additionally, I've scoured reading lists that universities used to provide. I went back to my own courses that I had at uni, and I've cross-referenced all the material to come up with a list of 238 works that make, according to me, the backbone of German literature throughout the centuries. So in this video, I want to give you that list and provide a bit of context, so you can use it as a map to navigate and pick your own readings from. I've also put the full list as a free PDF on my Teachable website, so you can download it there, print it, scratch things off, whatever you need to do with it. In the PDF, I've also underlined what I believe are the 30 or so books that are most worth your time if you want to engage with German literature in a serious way. They're the books that had, in my estimate, the most far-reaching influence inside and outside of the German language. Again, it's totally free, and it will be linked as the first link in the description box below this video. I'll also link the main sources that I've used to compile this list in the description box. And quickly, I just want to take a moment to talk about what's not on this list. Namely, there are no writings of philosophy, psychology, sociology, or literary theory on this list. This list focuses on primary literature, mostly fiction, because otherwise it would just get out of hand. Similarly, of course, French, English, Spanish, and many other literatures had an enormous influence on the literature that was written in the German language. So what we're doing in this video is a kind of artificial narrowing down of only works that were written in the German language. The last thing that is not in this video is recommendations for translations. I'm not recommending any specific translations yet, so even if I mention a title or depict an image of a book, it doesn't mean that I endorse that translation. That will also be part of my later research. The last thing I'll say, if you think I forgot something, an author or a work that you deem important, or you see that I've made a mistake, I've written the wrong date somewhere or something, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email. I'll consider adapting the PDF with your considerations, and I'll also pin a comment at the top of the comment section in which I'll make my adaptations transparent. Okay, let's take a deep dive into the German canon together now. Going through the list chronologically, the first category I have here is literature before 1600. The beginnings of German literature are quite hard to point to because, as I've already said, the tradition is rooted in oral literature. Additionally, before 1600, written texts were often strongly religious and/or written in Latin. So in the Middle Ages, texts in German were really the exception, and writing in general was something few people were able to do. One of the very first surviving texts, though, is the Hildebrandslied, written down around the year 830, and it's a short, heroic poem about a father and a son meeting on a battlefield, not knowing who the other one is. The text is written in Old High German, which was spoken before the year 1000. And the first great epic poem of the German language that we have access to today is from the 13th century, and that is the Song of Nibelungs by an unknown author. That is written in Middle High German, which was spoken between 1050 and 1350, roughly. Both languages, both Middle High German and Old High German, are languages I can't speak and need translations for today. So that's why this category is rather spare. I feel like unless you're really focusing specifically on literature from the Middle Ages, you're probably not too interested in Middle High German and Old High German texts. And I think looking at these texts will suffice to get an impression. So I only have a couple of handfuls of recommendations for this period, and they are the Minnelieder by Walter von der Vogelweide, Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach, Tristan by Gottfried von Straßburg, The Sermons of Meister Eckhart, The Ship of Fools by Sebastian Brandt, Fortunas by an unknown author, and The Bondage of Will, a 1525 text by Martin Luther. Luther was the first to translate the Bible into German in 1522, which leads me to mention that, of course, an intimate knowledge of the Bible is quite vital for understanding so many references in German texts all the way up to the 20th century. Luther was convinced that every Christian should be able to read the Bible. So for Luther, reading and writing was very important, which really did help to establish a standardized German language later on. But again, we're not there yet. In the Middle Ages, Latin was the main language for literature, which was quite funny because if you were a student back there, you could just go and study at any university in Europe because all the lectures were in Latin and the students and professors talked to each other in Latin. Moving into the 17th century, we still have many different variants and dialects of the German language. And amongst those who could read, which was still the minority, it was quite usual to read in many different languages. People who had the time and money to afford reading, they often easily read in French or Italian. So that is another reason why the German language and literature had a hard time establishing itself. More importantly, though, to that point, when we take a look at this map from 1648, we can see that Germany, as we know it today, hasn't formed yet. The region was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities without a real political center, so it was, by consequence, a patchwork of languages. The people living in this Holy Roman Empire of the German nation couldn't understand each other yet very well. If you didn't live in the same region, you just had no standardized German language to communicate in, neither written nor spoken. So that makes it quite difficult to speak of a German literature at all around that time. In the 17th century, the 30-Year War also brought much instability and moral confusion, frankly. One of the key novels from that period is Grimmelhausen's Simplicissimus, which is a picaresque novel. And in that novel, we follow a kind of naive protagonist through the horrors of war. And this book, written by Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelhausen, is a real outlier at the time, because authorship as we understand it today hasn't really been established yet. The the only way to be a writer was to have a courtly client who pays you to write certain poems or texts for theater. And being an independent author who is trying to publish his book and get it to the masses, that just wasn't a thing yet. So it's independent in that way, this book, and it really is a satire of the world back then. It's again about war. It's about a child who loses their parents and he becomes a child soldier. And the novel is both realistic, but it also has quite a lot of fantastical elements. So that is probably the novel of German Baroque that we consider most important today. And now that I've spoken of Baroque, Baroque is roughly what we call the 17th century in German literature. The term Baroque itself is actually something of a retrospective label and not really a flattering one. It was used later to describe actually mainly the architecture of the 17th century, and the term suggests something overly ornate and exaggerated and excessively decorated. And the same Baroque elements that we see in architecture, they also come through in literature, right? Elaborate metaphors, quite stylized word choices, and just kind of dressed up language. The 18th century, as we'll see in a bit, will react quite strongly against all of that. So as I already indicated, the establishment of a single standardized German language as we have today is really delayed compared to other European countries where unified literary languages at least have already emerged. Think France, England, Spain. We have many more novels that are still being read today and that are important in those languages, not so much in the German language. I think the language that we speak today has established around 1750 or something. So pretty much the books from then on are the same language that we speak today. Like there might be a couple of words that seem a bit strange, but overall we can understand it. And that's also thanks to the 30-Year War, right? That was waging from 1618 to 1648. And the 30-Year War wasn't one war, it was really a whole series of interconnected wars. And it was also not really one single conflict, but it was like a complex European struggle between Protestant and Catholic powers. And it has led to the fact that cultural and economic developments were stifled for decades, basically, leaving these regions lagging behind countries like England and France for a long time. So for a long time, appreciation for literature written in German is relatively rare, because Latin, French, Italian literatures, all of these carried more prestige. Now that was until Martin Opitz published quite a key work of theory, a book called Buch der deutschen Poeterei in 1624. This is something of a first conscious effort to regulate and standardize German as a literary language, because people were quite sick of the fact that their writings in German weren't taken seriously. So in this book, Opitz was laying down the rules for German poetry. So it's a work of theory, but because of its importance, I still put it on this list. Opitz tries to systematically lay down rules for how German poetry should be written, so which meters to use, which words and rhymes are appropriate, what counts as elegant and what is like a no-no. And the very existence of such a rule book really shows that German literature is beginning to be taken seriously. Around the same time, theater and opera begin to grow in popularity, and one such play that is worth mentioning is the 1657 play by Andreas Gryphius called Katharina von Georgien, Catherine of Georgia. It's a domestic or bourgeois tragedy, as they translate it into English. In German, it's called a bürgerliches Trauerspiel. And the characteristics of such a bürgerliches Trauerspiel are that the protagonists are now, for the first time, ordinary citizens, and those ordinary citizens, and usually it is the case that one of them has a strong moral conviction and is very faithful to their values, and that kind of staying true to their values gets them killed, hanged, murdered. So their virtue is really tested through suffering, but the message behind it is then kind of a positive one, because in the afterlife those people usually get rewarded for, staying strong. Andreas Gryphius also wrote some beautiful poetry, so I recommend you check that out too. Here are a couple of lines from the poem Abend. Dein ewig heller Glanz sei vor und neben mir. Lass, wenn der müde Leib erschläft, die Seele wachen. Und wenn der letzte Tag wird mit mir Abend machen, so reiß mich aus dem Tal der Finsternis zu dir. Most literature from that time still has a very strong religious undertone, I would say. So yeah, besides those works that I've mentioned, I recommend you also check out The Cherubinic Wanderer by Angelus Silesius and Szelmowski by Christian Reuter. Now, the 18th century is the age of enlightenment. So while in the 17th century most texts still had a strong religious connotation, there now comes a shift away from that. And across Europe, thinkers start to question authorities like the church, and they move toward the human being as the center of intellectual life. You can hear that spirit beautifully expressed in Alexander Pope's essay on Men, in which he says, "Know then thyself, presume no God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." This new worldview of questioning authorities on every level is also what will eventually lead to the American and the French Revolution. And literature, most certainly, is viewed through that lens as well. Art is no longer supposed to exist merely for pleasure or ornament. It must justify itself as something that helps improve humanity. That is something that Goethe and Schiller will criticize quite a lot later, and also the Romantics were very critical of this Nützlichkeitsgedanken in literature. But many of the Enlightenment thinkers were convinced that the best literary form is drama, theater. Why drama? Because literacy rates were still relatively low, books were expensive, and so the theater was able to reach the widest audience while also having the strongest emotional impact. One of the major theoretical works from that time is Johann Christoph Gottsched's treatise called Kritische Dichtkunst, where he argues that the theater should educate by appealing to reason. A bit later, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing modifies that idea and says that theater reforms us not primarily through logic, but through emotions. So when we feel pity with an actor on stage, we're more likely to also feel pity with the people in our real life. Some of Lessing's plays are still very well known today. Nathan the Wise, for example, deals with the question of which religion is the right one. And Emilia Galotti is again a bürgerliches Trauerspiel, quite tragic. The play ends with Emilia begging her father to kill her because she's afraid that she'll succumb to the seduction of some prints. Quite an Enlightenment-coded message, if you think about it. Thinkers of the Enlightenment really thought it was important to keep a lid on one's emotion and to not let them dictate your life. So, Emilia Galotti, really important. If you're taking any course of German literature somewhere, you're probably gonna have to read Emilia Galotti. It's gonna be on the reading list. And if you're a fan of The Sorrows of Young Werther, you'll also see that when Werther kills himself at the end, he has an open book of Emilia Galotti laying next to him. Now, taking a quick look at the novel in the 18th century, we can see that novels still have quite a bad reputation. Critics basically dismiss them for being cheap entertainment. However, there is one novel worth mentioning here that acts as a little bit of a turning point in that worldview, and that is Christoph Martin Wieland's The History of Agathon. It's inspired partly by Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, and it explores a question that is quite central in the Enlightenment age, and that is it better to be virtuous or to look out for one's own gains? The ending remains a little bit open, but what is important about this book is that Lessing famously called it, quote, the first German novel for the thinking mind. So that's what I meant with this turning point. Slowly, novels become philosophical and no longer pure entertainment. Poetry makes a big step too in the 18th century. Poetry becomes what most people still think it is today. Like, I think if you would ask people today what you write poetry for, they would say that poetry allows a space for subjective reflection, emotion, for the inner life, and for feelings that are maybe hard to articulate or something. And that wasn't always the case. That's really an idea that formed in the 18th century. Earlier in the 17th century, for example, poems were often quite formal, rhetorical, and also collective. Poems used a lot of we, for example. But we're also still in the Enlightenment, so there's a bit of tension in poetry between like subjective emotion and taking responsibility that you kind of feel playing out in the poetry of the 18th century. One well-known poet from that time is Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock, who really inspired an entire younger generation of writers. Writers like Goethe and Schiller admired him immensely. And I even think that Werther and Lotte in The Sorrows of Young Werther, they read the poetry of Klopstock at some point. Now, speaking of Goethe, one literary form that emerges in the 18th century and is seen to be ideal for exploring the inner emotional struggles of people is the epistolary novel. So, a story told through letters. And the most famous example of that time, and I feel like still to this day of all of German literature, the most well-known epistolary novel is The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, written in 1774. Not gonna lie, I love that book with the passion of 1,000 burning suns. This is the novel that made Goethe world famous, and the way readers resonated with Werther, with our protagonist, really shocked Goethe, actually. There was a real Werther cult going on, people dressed like him. Some people apparently even imitated his suicide. Now, I've made a video once about the suicide wave this novel apparently caused. It's a bit of a dubious assumption. I'll link the video in case you want to go watch it. Now, anyways, our lovely Werther, whose full name we never learn, is really overwhelmed by his emotions, unsure of his place in a rapidly changing world, and he is a victim both of his psyche but also of the time that he lives in, because everything is speeding up. They probably felt the same way that we feel today. So Werther lives in a time where everything seems to speed up and where there's really no place for his artsy, slow reflections, for his dreams, and for his way of seeing things. In one of my favorite letters, he says, Ich kehre in mich selbst zurück und finde eine Welt, wieder mehr in Ahnung und dunkler Begier, als in Darstellung und lebendiger Kraft. Und da schwimmt alles vor meinen Sinnen, und ich lächle dann so träumend weiter in die Welt. So good. Now, if you're interested at all in German literature of the 18th century, you've most certainly heard about the Sturm und Drang movement. It's sometimes talked about as its own literary epoch. Strictly speaking, it's not quite large enough to count as an epoch. It's maybe 10, 15 writers in a handful of German cities who wrote a specific kind of literature for a few years, but it had an enormous impact, so I understand why some people call it an epoch. Anyways, these writers of Sturm und Drang, they rebelled against what they see as the Enlightenment's overemphasis on reason. So they take a real stance against that by celebrating passion and individuality. For those authors, most famously again Goethe and Schiller, the highest artistic ideal is the genius, right? Der Geniegedanke, also something we haven't quite been able to get rid of since then. And it basically just means that someone who writes or creates art is not following rules, but they're just writing out of necessity, right? Like there's just this overflow of emotions, and art is not something that can be learned. You either just have it or you don't. Shakespeare plays an important role here and was something of an idol for the writers of the Sturm und Drang period. Shakespeare was almost unknown in German-speaking countries before, but now he really does become the one that everyone is looking up to. In a 1771 speech, Goethe famously said, "Nature, nothing so natural as Shakespeare's people." I think in German it is, "Und ich rufe Natur, Natur, nicht so Natur als Shakespeare's Menschen." Agreed, Goethe. And that's a very telling way of putting it, because Goethe is referring to William Shakespeare, not as if he was an author, but almost like he's a force of nature. Goethe's own play of theatre, Götz of Berlichingen, is quite a quintessential Sturm und Drang drama. It has a wild structure, many scenes, so very Shakespeare-like in that way, strong emotions, and a rebellious hero at the center of the play. And Martin Luther appears as a side character, which is why knowing Luther, as I mentioned a bit earlier, really helps when reading German literature. Now, towards the end of the century, Goethe and Schiller begin somewhat to merge Enlightenment ideas with Sturm und Drang, and they're searching for a balance between reason and emotions, or a synthesis. And that becomes what we now call Weimar Classicism, Weimarer Klassik. An epoch that was later often positioned as like the pinnacle of German literature. There really are some people that think it has only been downhill since then. The ideal in that time is, as I already indicated, a harmony between thought and emotion, and the idea that literature should elevate people, not just kind of excite and entertain them. Goethe's Iphigenia of Tauris is one such play where you can really see this synthesis happening. So there is emotion, but it's embedded in a very clear structure. It's like classically composed, based on a Greek myth, and completely different from like the wildness of Goethe. As Goethe himself admits, it's a very utopian drama. The central line in the play is "Zwischen uns sei Wahrheit," or "Between us let there be truth." So the end is happy because people dared to say the truth and appealed to the humanity in each other. And telling the truth even leads to kind of healing psychological suffering in this play. Now there's much to be said about the friendship between Schiller and Goethe. I'm not gonna get into that here, but Schiller always encourages Goethe to keep writing on his things, and because of Schiller, Goethe finally also completes Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. And as I already said, their collaboration really turned Weimar into the intellectual capital of German literature. One last thing that I think is important to mention about the 18th century is that it is the time when people begin writing actual histories of German literature, something that hasn't existed before, because now German language kind of becomes aware of itself as a thing. And Johann Gottfried Herder, for example, was very important for that shift, because he argued that a nation is defined by the language that it speaks. Also not an idea that we've always had. And he also said that one's mother tongue really shapes someone's identity. So suddenly German literature, the way we think of today, it's becoming a thing. You know what I mean? And at the same time, readership also grows quite rapidly in parts of Central Europe, because schooling becomes compulsory for children, and more people are just able to read and to write. So here is my final list of recommendations for the 18th century. Dying Cato by Johann Christoph Gottsched, The History of Agathon by Christoph Martin Wieland, The Odes of Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock, Emilia Galotti by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Götz of Berlichingen by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Der Hofmeister by Jakob Michael Reinhold Lenz, Minna auf Barnhelm by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, The Child Murderers by Heinrich Leopold Wagner, Nathan the Wise by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, The Robbers by Friedrich Schiller, Love and Intrigue by Friedrich Schiller, Ode to Joy by Friedrich Schiller, which is just a single poem, but I think it is worth reading as it has become the European hymn, Iphigenia in Tauris by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, also by Goethe, Selected Poems and Fragments by Friedrich Hölderlin, and Puss in Boots by Ludwig Tieck. In the 19th century, reading habits now change quite dramatically. So while in the 18th century, reading was usually still a communal activity and people read out loud to each other in groups, reading now becomes a solitary activity and you read silently on your own. Literature also stops being an elite privilege. So as education spreads and literacy rises and also the cost of printing becomes cheaper, a mass market for literature starts to emerge. And now in the 19th century, the novel and the novella become incredibly important. Interestingly, at first the novella is considered to be a way more prestigious form than the novel, because it used to follow very strict structural rules. I think Goethe defined the novella as an unheard of event that actually happened. so it should be realistic and highly crafted. So it had like a very defined structure of an entry, kind of a high point and then a resolution and like a moral takeaway. And novels in the meantime were often still like dismissed as entertainment for the masses. Though, of course, that changes as we're moving through the century. Now, as we're entering the 19th century, we're seeing a real shift away from the ideals of enlightenment when it comes to the content of literature. Whereas before it was really concerned with politics and, the kind of the outside world, literature now moves inwards. It turns inwards towards subjectivity, imagination, dreams and folklore, and that really marks the beginning of Romanticism. Romanticism is in many ways a reaction to the modernization and technological progress at the time. Writers became fascinated with nature and myth, like they kind of wanted to go back there. They also loved the medieval past and the inner life of the individual. So the Romantics don't like the fact that the world is becoming so disenchanted by all this questioning of religion and the technological progress. And they sort of use literature, you could say, to re-enchant the world. Early German Romantics include Novalis, Ludwig Tieck, or the Schlegel brothers. And one of the most important symbols of that literary movement appears right at the start in Novalis' unfinished novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen from 1802. Novalis was actually a pen name. His real name was Friedrich von Hardenberg, and he wrote this novel partly in response to Goethe. So let me explain. Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship has introduced something to German literature that was completely new at the time and that scholars started to call the Bildungsroman, the coming-of-age novel, as it is often translated. In these novels, we usually follow a young protagonist who grows up, learns about the world, forms his character, gains insight, and then usually ends up in some form back where he started, but kind of reformed. This is a genre that is gonna dominate German prose for basically the next century or so. And Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship by Goethe forms the beginning. So it was an immensely important book that back then, and all the young romantics read it. They loved a lot about it, but what they hated was the end. Because in Goethe's novel, Wilhelm Meister doesn't become an artist. He doesn't become what he sets out to be. He kind of settles for a comfortable or practical life. And the romantics really didn't like that idea. So Novalis wrote Heinrich von Ofterdingen as a kind of counter-project to Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. So Novalis' protagonist does become an artist at the end. It's very funny because the book was even published in the same format and looked very similar visually, and it was also published from the same publishing house. Like it was a deliberate counter-project, mirror text. Again, Novalis not being happy with Goethe. He said that Goethe's novel is, quote, a Candide against poetics. So Novalis' novel begins with the protagonist having a dream, Heinrich, and when he wakes up he tells his father about his dream, and he tells him that he saw a blue flower. His father then replies that he has often, he used to dream of that blue flower as well, but that he has stopped searching for it. Heinrich doesn't give up searching for it, and the blue flower becomes kind of the central symbol for Romanticism. It stands for, I don't know, that longing, beauty, the inner life, the pursuing of one's art. Much can be kind of discussed what the blue flower really means, but it has something to do with an ideal one is pursuing that, maybe not everyone dares to pursue. So Novalis died really young, I think at 29 years old, and his novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen is unfinished. So I think we don't really know whether the novel is unfinished because he died so early or because that was on purpose. Because the Romantics loved open endings, unfinished works, and fragments, right? Like for them, art wasn't a finished object, and it was also the Romantics who steered literature towards being self-aware. So really one could argue that this marks the beginning of modernism. So in the early 19th century, there was also a growing fascination with folk culture and the Middle Ages, which is why the brothers Grimm begin collecting fairy tales, not just as children's stories as we think of them today, but as cultural memory. So their Grimm's fairy tales, which came out collected in 1812, are among the most influential books from that time, and I really recommend you check them out. It was really believed back then that, you can find something of the German soul or whatever in these fairy tales, and they went around collecting them. Now, of course, later we found out that many of them were French and from many different cultures, not just German. Now, another major writer from that time who I find so strange but so wonderful is Heinrich von Kleist. His novella The Earthquake in Chile from 1807 is one of my favorite short texts in German literature. It begins with a man who is about to hang himself, and then this huge earthquake hits. As the story progresses, he thinks that maybe in the middle of this disaster, his sins may be forgiven. So the story moves incredibly fast, and it has a really dark ending, kind of. Kleist always moves straight to the point, but his endings often kind of seem happy or something, but in a very questionable, strange way. Like it's a little unsettling. But I think about that short story like once a week, at least. It's one of those. Now, a branch of Romanticism develops into what's often called dark Romanticism, and here we find writers like E.T.A. Hoffmann, who brings the uncanny, psychological, what will later be called the unconscious, eerie things into literature. His story, The Sandman, is probably one of the most discussed texts of German literature of all time. The protagonist, Nathaniel, seems to be losing his mind, but we're never quite sure whether what he sees might not be real. Maybe he's insane, but maybe he's also just unusually sensitive or something. And that would be an idea that would really track with the Romantics. Hoffmann was hugely influential, which is also why it's one of the works that I've underlined in my list. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe drew lots of inspiration from his stories. Now, around the middle of the century, there is lots of political upheaval all over Europe. And in literature, there is a shift towards realism. And that means that writers now describe everyday life with like a sober precision. One author definitely worth mentioning here is Theodor Fontane, who's often called the German Flaubert. I think that the book he's most well known for is Effi Briest from 1896, which could be coined as a novel of psychological realism, and it's quite well known, I feel like, beyond German language borders. Another work of realism is Heinrich Heine's Germany, A Winter's Tale, which is a kind of satirical critique of censorship and nationalism. As I've already mentioned, German writers were always very influenced by French literature as well. So Gerhard Hauptmann wrote a play, The Weavers, in 1892. And that is a play that was heavily influenced by Émile Zola's Germinal. So if we map the movement of the 19th century, it would be something like romanticism to realism to naturalism. Now I'll depict the 19th century reading list that I came up with now, and I'll only mention out loud a few important works. So we have Friedrich Schiller, his Maria Stuart, his poems, Heinrich von Kleist, as I already mentioned, The Earthquake in Chile, but also the Marquise of O. Novalis's Hymns to the Night, very much worth reading, and his Heinrich von Ofterdingen, the Grimm fairy tales, a few stories by E.T.A. Hoffmann, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust Part 1 and Part 2, and Grillparzer's King Ottokar's Fortune and Fall, Georg Büchner's Lenz, Johann Nestroy's The Talisman, Adalbert Stifter's Indian Summer, Georg Büchner's Wojciech, Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche, and Arthur Schnitzler's Liebelei, as well as the already mentioned Theodor Fontane with Effi Briest. And now we're moving into the 20th century, my favorite. It's quite well known that modernist writers struggle with the instability of reality and how we can't really know anything, right? There has been so much disillusionment happening in the 20th century, also because of the wars, and language, identity, narration, like everything just becomes very uncertain. And if we look at the novella, we can really see the changes that modernism brings to literature. The novella doesn't vanish in the 20th century, but it stops being this beautifully engineered form with like a clear beginning, a high point, and then a resolution. The novellas in the 20th century don't always resolve or explain, and they often feel like a random slice cut out of someone's life. It's as if we're just kind of entering the story at a random moment, and the narrative has gone on before we read, and it continues after we leave the story. The English term short story is adopted into German for that, and this sense of incompleteness is really, it's such a telltale sign of modernism, right? Like the incompleteness is not seen as a flaw anymore. One important author to mention here is Franz Kafka, of course. He writes about individuals that are trapped inside systems that they don't understand and can't escape. And I think the incredible resonance that people have felt with his figures just shows something of the zeitgeist that we live in right now. It doesn't really matter which Kafka novel you read. I feel like The Metamorphosis is most well known outside the German language, but we at uni always talk about The Trial and The Castle, but it doesn't matter because in all of them the protagonists kind of struggle without ever reaching clarity or resolution. And we, as the readers, really feel trapped in the same way, because we're as confused and uncertain as the protagonists are, because that's the only point of view we have and that we can work with as readers. An important poet from that time would definitely be Rainer Maria Rilke. His poetry is very symbolic, and I would almost say like a search for spiritual meaning. I'm currently reading the notebooks of Malte Lauritz Brigger, and it's a very very typically modernist, like this young man who comes to Paris and is kind of just overwhelmed with how fast everything moves and doesn't know his place in the world. That's really kind of the blueprint for so much of modernist literature. Like, we have a protagonist who doesn't really fit in, doesn't really find his way in life, and we get his thoughts, his point of view, his struggles, often in a stream of consciousness kind of way. Think Ulysses, think In Search of Lost Time, or think Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin. Definitely another one of the big German novels of the 20th century, also about modern city life. So at the beginning of the 20th century, German literature really moves into what I think one of the most creative periods in German literary history. So many creative boundaries are being pushed at once, and I've kind of gotten overwhelmed with trying to not necessarily put the list together, but with kind of giving you a narrative of the 20th century, because it's just, everything just seemed to explode. Like, once I had a literature course only about the kind of literary movements around 1900, everything from like Dadaism and Surrealism and Expressionism and Futurism. It's just way too much to get into in this video. So I'm just gonna mention a few that I think are of particular interest. And actually a novel that sums up the plurality of ideas and ideals at that time really well is, of course, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. I've made 2 videos about this novel, so I won't spend too much time talking about it here. But to me, it's the novel that transports the feeling of what it must have been like to live in Europe before World War I the best. I really love this book. I want a tattoo of the last sentence like on my body. Now, in theater, we of course can't talk about the 20th century without talking about Bertolt Brecht. He develops his epic theater, and what that means is that he is kind of rejecting traditional dramatic illusions. So instead of making the audience emotionally identify with characters, Brecht wants the viewers to stay critical and analytical. If you remember that discussion I talked about in, I think, the 18th century, is that right? If you think about that discussion between Goethe and Lessing in the 18th century, right? Should theater appeal to our reason or should it appeal to our emotions? Well, Brecht now kind of says that it's not enough for theater to appeal to our emotions, because then we're just like all sentimental, teary-eyed, but we don't do anything. It doesn't lead to any action. For Brecht, political action is kind of the most important purpose of theater, like educating critical minds. I recently read The Good Person of Sichuan and really loved it, a very readable theater play, and I think I put Mother Courage and Her Children on the reading list. Now, when the Nazis come to power in 1933, many authors are fleeing the country, right? Such as Thomas Mann and Brecht that I already mentioned, but so many more. And there's lots of literature written in exile, and when the war ends, there really is that question, that big question of how can one write after Auschwitz? Like, how can we, I don't know, like how can one write a poem or feel anything after what has been done to so many people? That's the question that was formulated by Theodor Adorno, and that's a question that really hangs over everything that follows. Writers really struggled with what has been done to the German language, and they struggled with the guilt and the trauma and the silence and the question of responsibility. Early texts after World War II are often called a Trümmerliteratur, rubble literature, and it really shows the struggle of trying to find something to hold on again in literature. The tone is very sober and direct and almost stripped of style. After 1949, Germany is split into East and West, and literature develops quite differently on both sides. In East Germany, social realism dominates. So literature, what was asked of literature was to kind of present positive role models and to embody collective ideals. But in West Germany, writers continued to experiment a little bit more freely with style and form. One of the most influential post-war authors is Günter Grass. His novel The Tin Drum is a work that, like, in a very dark, grotesque way, revisits the Nazi period. Another author worth mentioning is W.G. Sebald, whose works kind of blurs the boundaries between fiction and essay and photography and memoir. I put his novel Austerlitz on the reading list, and it deals with kind of the lingering shadows of the past, as the protagonist is like looking into his own past. Other important authors who are dealing with the past in some way are Elfriede Jelinek, who would later win the Nobel Prize, and Thomas Bernhard, who like relentlessly attacks Austrian society for repressing its Nazi past, basically. The 20th century list is quite large, but a few works worth mentioning are definitely from 1900 to 1930, Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, The Metamorphoses by Franz Kafka, Arthur Schnitzler's Leutnant Gustl, Robert Walser's The Walk from 1917, Karl Krause's The Last Days of Mankind, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Arthur Schnitzler's Fräulein Else, The Trial by Franz Kafka. Another Arthur Schnitzler I love is Dream Story. I would personally put everything by Arthur Schnitzler on that list. Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse and Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin. From 1930 to 1950, some works worth mentioning are The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth, Autour da Fée by Elias Canetti, which is my favorite professor's favorite book. Mephisto by Klaus Mann, Beware of Pity by Stefan Zweig, also The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig, Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, Mother Courage and Her Children by Bertolt Brecht, and moving into the 1950s until about 1975, we have The Strudelhof Steps by Helmito von Doderer, Poppy and Memory by Paul Celan, The Visit by Friedrich Dürrenmatt, another play I think about almost on a weekly basis. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Max Frisch's Homo Faber, The Tin Drum by Günter Grass, Marlene Haushofer's The Wall, Heinrich Böll's Group Portrait with Lady, and Ingeborg Bachmann's Malina. From 1975 until 2000, I want to mention Thomas Bernhard's Hero Square and The Loser, Elfriede Jelinek's The Pianist, Emine Özdemir's Mother Tongue, Bernhard Schlink's The Reader, and the last one by Jelinek called The Children of the Dead. So now, as we have moved into the postmodern era, into the time that we live in, it becomes more and more difficult to speak about a single dominant movement in literature. And it's also quite different to, it's difficult to speak about literature when you don't have that much distance to it yet, right? You don't yet know what stays and what has emerged. So 21st century German literature, and I think really all literatures over the world, they're defined by an incredible plurality. Contemporary German literature is often multilingual, transnational, and deals with things that we deal with today, right? Migration, climate change, capitalism, identity, artificial intelligence, technological advances. That is the thematic landscape that writers respond to. So there's not a single clear center that we can point to at this moment. And also authorship is changing quite a lot. Writers today are far more individualized. There's not this kind of sense of a communities of authors anymore that has been actually really relevant all throughout the history of German literature. I mean, I haven't really mentioned it here, but there have always been groups that concerned themselves with advancing the language, advancing literature. We're a lot more, individualized today. At the same time, authors are also a lot more visible through the development of social media and through online and self-publishing. So there is a better ability to cultivate a direct relationship with the readers. Experimental writing definitely still exists, but it doesn't make it onto bestseller lists, let's just put it that way. And I'm gonna say, even though those developments that I've talked about, they're all reflected in literature, but I would say it's undeniable that we're still not done working through the traumas of the past. So there are plenty of novels revisiting what happened during World War II. Specifically, The Hunger Angel by Herta Müller is one of them. One of the most emotionally most difficult books that I have ever read. It reconstructs the experience of labor camps after World War II through a language that is very direct and very clear, but poetic at the same time. She's really an amazing author. But I wasn't kind of ready for that book emotionally when I read it last year. So here is a little list of works that cover the range of topics that I mentioned. W.G. Sebalds Austerlitz, Thomas Hürlimanns Fräulein Stark, Günter Grass Crab Walk, Katrin Rögler Wir schlafen nicht, Daniel Kehlmanns Measuring the World, Katrin Röglers Draußen tobt die Dunkelziffer, Daniel Glattauers Love Virtually, Anne Cottons Fremdwörterbuchsonette, Clemens Meyers All the Lights, Herta Müller's The Hunger Angel, Theresia Mora's The Only Man on the Continent, Julie C.'s Corpus Delicti, Wolfgang Herrndorf's Why We Took the Car, Yoko Tawada's The Naked Eye, Judith Herrmann's Summer House Later, Felicitas Hopper's Hopper, Sascha Marianna Salzmann's Mother Tongue Mamelogen, Elfriede Jelinek's Charges the Supplicants, Robert Schindels The Cold One, Stephanie Sarnagel's Binge Living, Jenny Erpenbeck's Go Went Gone, Abbas Kida's A Slap in the Face, Robert Menasse's The Capital, Michael Lenz's Schattenfroh, Sascha Stanischek's Where You Come From, Evelyn Grill's Der Begabte und Monika Helfers Last House Before the Mountain. So that marks the end of my list. I hope there's something in there that inspires you. Again, don't forget to download the PDF that accompanies this video for free. The link to it is in the description box below. And let me know if you think I forgot anything. I'm very curious for your feedback. Thanks for being with me here today, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye bye.